Mein Gott, I'll never forget the moment on July 23, 1944, when I counted over 200 American Sherman tanks moving through the Belgian countryside around Saint-Vith like a steel tide, their 75mm guns trained on my solitary Panzer IV, while Wehrmacht radio crackled with panicked reports from across our entire front. The summer sun glinted off endless rows of American armor, stretching to the horizon. Diesel exhaust mixed with the smell of cordite from ongoing bombardments, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear American swing music playing from loudspeakers mounted on their tanks. Glenn Miller's In the Mood serving as a soundtrack to Germany's industrial defeat. I was Hauptmann Klaus Iron Cross Weber, Panzer Regiment 25, 7th Panzer Division, and after 3 years of armored warfare from the steppes of Russia to the bocage of Normandy, I thought I understood everything about tank combat, about German engineering superiority, about the invincibility of properly trained panzer crews fighting inferior Allied equipment. I'd earned my nickname destroying 17 Soviet T-34s during the Battle of Kursk, had seen American Shermans burn like torches when hit by our superior 75mm KWK-40 guns, and truly believed that one German panzer was worth 5 Allied tanks in any combat situation. But what I witnessed during that summer afternoon in Belgium would shatter every assumption I'd held about American industrial capability, tactical doctrine, and the mathematics of modern warfare. Those hundreds of Sherman tanks would teach me that individual superiority meant nothing against overwhelming numbers, that German engineering excellence couldn't compensate for American production supremacy, and that we weren't just fighting American soldiers, we were fighting the entire American economy transformed into a military machine. My journey to that devastating realization began on June 6, 1944, when news of the Normandy landings reached our positions near Caen, where the 7th Panzer Division was held in reserve as part of Panzer Group West's mobile defense strategy. Initially, our officers told us that this was the diversionary attack we'd been expecting, that the real Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, where German intelligence indicated the main Allied force was concentrated. Kameraden, announced Major Friedrich Schultz during our morning briefing on D-Day, the Americans and British have finally shown themselves. A few divisions have landed in Normandy, but our panzers will drive them back into the sea within days. Their Sherman tanks are no match for our Panzer IVs and Panthers. This confidence was based on combat experience that seemed to support German technical superiority. During our first encounters with American armor in Tunisia and Sicily, Sherman tanks had proven vulnerable to German anti-tank guns and Panzer cannons. Their 75mm guns could penetrate German armor only at close range, while our long-barreled guns could destroy Shermans at distances exceeding 1,500 meters. The Americans build quantity, but we build quality, Major Schultz continued. One properly handled German panzer can destroy multiple Sherman tanks before they can close to effective range. This assessment was reinforced by our initial combat experiences during the Normandy battles. My Panzer IV, commanded by veteran crew members who'd fought from Stalingrad to Sicily, had accounted for 8 Sherman tanks during the first week of combat around Villers-Bocage. Each engagement confirmed German tactical and technical superiority. Our better optics allowed earlier target acquisition. Our superior ammunition could penetrate Sherman armor at longer ranges, and our crew training was more thorough than American tank training. These American tin cans burn beautifully when you hit them properly, I told my crew after our 5th Sherman kill on June 15th. Their armor is too thin, their guns too weak, their crews too inexperienced. Fighting American tanks is like shooting practice against moving targets. My gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Müller, agreed completely. Herr Hauptmann, American tanks are built for mass production, not for combat effectiveness. They're cheaper and faster to build, but they can't match German engineering and craftsmanship. This confidence was shared throughout the Panzer Regiment and reflected broader German assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. We believed that technical superiority, superior training, and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantages, just as it had during our earlier victories in Poland, France, and the initial phases of the Russian campaign. But the first crack in this confidence appeared during the week of July 10, 1944, when American armored divisions began their breakout from the Normandy beachhead during Operation Cobra. Instead of the scattered Sherman companies we'd been fighting, we began encountering American tank battalions, then regiments, then entire armored divisions moving in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed local German defenses through sheer weight of numbers. Herr Major, I reported to regimental headquarters after observing American forces near Coutances. The Americans appear to have at least 50 tanks in this sector alone. Intelligence estimated no more than 20 American tanks in this entire area. Major Schultz's response reflected the confusion that was spreading through German command structures as they tried to understand the scale of American armored deployment. Intelligence reports are being updated, Weber. American tank production has been higher than expected, but remember, 50 American tanks still represent only 10 effective German tanks. Quality will triumph over quantity, but quantity was becoming quality through improved American tactics, better crew training, and technological upgrades that were closing the gap between Sherman and German tank capabilities. The new Sherman variants we encountered after July 15th carried 76mm guns that could penetrate German armor at reasonable ranges, while American tank crews were demonstrating improved tactical coordination that maximized their numerical advantages. More disturbing was the apparent endlessness of American tank replacements. Every Sherman we destroyed seemed to be replaced by 2 more, while German Panzer losses could barely be replaced at all. Our regiment had begun the Normandy campaign with 42 operational Panzers, but by mid-July we were down to 18 effective tanks despite receiving minimal battle damage compared to infantry units. "Where are all these American tanks coming from?" asked my driver, Gefreiter Otto Brenner, as we observed yet another column of Shermans moving toward the front. "We've destroyed dozens of them, but there are always more." I didn't have an answer, because German intelligence had failed to anticipate the scale of American industrial mobilization or the speed with which American factories could produce armored vehicles. We were fighting an enemy that could afford to lose tanks because they had unlimited replacements, while every German Panzer loss was irreplaceable. The reality of American industrial supremacy became undeniable during the morning of July 20th, when I was assigned to conduct a reconnaissance in force towards Saint-Vith to determine American strength in that sector. My orders were to probe American defenses with my single Panzer IV, supported by 2 other tanks from our increasingly depleted regiment. "Weber," Major Schultz explained during the briefing, "we need accurate intelligence about American tank concentrations near Saint-Vith. Approach cautiously. Engage only if you have clear tactical advantage, and report American strength immediately." The mission seemed routine based on our experience with American tank deployments, which had typically involved company-sized formations of 20 to 30 Sherman tanks operating in relatively predictable patterns. But as we approached the high ground overlooking Saint-Vith at 800 hours on July 23rd, what I saw through my commander's periscope defied everything I thought I knew about American armored capabilities. The valley below Saint-Vith was filled with American tanks. Not companies or battalions, but entire regiments of Sherman tanks organized in formations that stretched beyond my ability to count accurately. Through my binoculars, I could identify at least 4 different American armored battalions, plus supporting elements including tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and mechanized infantry. "Muller," I called to my gunner, "how many enemy tanks can you count in the main formation?" Muller spent several minutes studying the American deployment through his optical sight before responding with obvious disbelief. "Herr Hauptmann, I count at least 60 tanks in the nearest formation alone, and there are at least 3 more formations of similar size visible from this position." The mathematics were staggering. If each formation contained 60 tanks, and there were at least 4 formations visible, then we were observing over 240 American tanks in a single concentration near one relatively small Belgian town. This represented more armored vehicles than our entire Panzer division possessed at full strength. But the numbers became even more overwhelming as American forces began to move. At 08:45 hours, the Sherman formation started advancing in coordinated attacks that demonstrated tactical sophistication far superior to what we'd previously encountered from American armored forces. Instead of the direct frontal attacks that had characterized earlier American tank operations, these formations were employing flanking maneuvers, suppressive fire techniques, and combined arms coordination that reflected extensive training and battlefield experience. American tank crews were operating with the confidence and skill that we'd previously associated only with veteran German Panzer units. "Mein Gott," whispered my loader, Gefreiter Franz Richter. "There are so many American tanks that they look like ants swarming across the landscape." The analogy was accurate and terrifying. Individual Sherman tanks might be inferior to individual German Panzers, but when deployed in such overwhelming numbers with improved tactics, they created a military force that could simply overwhelm German defenses regardless of our technical advantages. As I continued to observe American movements through binoculars, I began to understand that we weren't just witnessing a large tank attack. We were seeing the deployment of an entirely new form of mechanized warfare based on industrial supremacy rather than technical excellence. American commanders were using their tanks like artillery pieces, concentrating massive firepower against individual German positions until resistance collapsed from sheer weight of ordnance. Even if German panzers could destroy multiple Shermans before being overwhelmed, the Americans could afford such losses because their industrial base was producing replacement tanks faster than we could destroy them. At 09:15 hours, the American formations began to move directly toward our observation position, and I realized that we'd been detected by American reconnaissance units. What had begun as an intelligence mission was about to become a desperate escape attempt against overwhelming odds. "All stations, this is Weber," I radioed to the other two German tanks in my reconnaissance group. "American armor strength is approximately 200 tanks. Repeat, 200 tanks. We are withdrawing immediately to avoid encirclement." But withdrawal was no longer possible. As I gave the order to retreat, American Sherman tanks appeared on the ridgelines to our north, south, and east, effectively surrounding our small German force with a steel ring that was tightening rapidly. Through my periscope, I could see dozens of Sherman 75mm guns trained on our position from multiple directions. American tank commanders were standing in their turret hatches, studying us through binoculars, calculating angles of fire and escape routes with the professional calm of experienced armored warfare specialists. "Herr Hauptmann," Müller reported, "I count at least 30 enemy tanks with direct line of sight to our position, and more are moving to surround us completely." The tactical situation was hopeless. 3 German panzers against over 30 American tanks, with more Shermans arriving every minute as the encirclement tightened. Even if we could destroy several American tanks before being overrun, the mathematical outcome was inevitable. But what struck me most forcefully wasn't the hopelessness of our tactical position. It was the professional competence with which American tank crews were executing this encirclement. These weren't the inexperienced, poorly trained Sherman crews we'd been told to expect. These were veteran tankers who understood armored warfare as well as any German panzer crew. At 09:30 hours, an American Sherman approached our position under a white flag, and an officer dismounted to offer terms for our surrender. He was a major, probably commanding the American tank battalion that had trapped us, and he spoke fluent German with the confidence of someone who'd studied our language and our military culture. "Herr Hauptmann," he called out, using my correct rank despite having no obvious way to identify it. "I am Major Robert Patterson, 3rd Armored Division. You are surrounded by overwhelming force with no possibility of escape. I offer you the opportunity to surrender with honor rather than die uselessly." His tone was respectful but firm, the voice of a professional soldier addressing an equal who happened to be on the losing side of an engagement. There was no mockery, no gloating, no attempt to humiliate defeated opponents. "Major Patterson," I replied, standing in my turret hatch to speak directly to him, "what assurance can you give regarding treatment of German prisoners?" "Full compliance with Geneva Convention standards," Patterson answered immediately. "Your crew will be treated with the respect due to professional soldiers who have fought honorably." As I considered his offer, I surveyed the American tanks that surrounded our position and finally comprehended the full scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just superior numbers, it was superior organization, superior logistics, superior industrial capacity, and increasingly superior tactical execution. The Sherman tanks were arranged in textbook defensive positions that would have impressed German panzer officers, with overlapping fields of fire, protected approaches, and reserve formations positioned to respond to any German breakout attempt. American radio discipline was excellent, with minimal chatter and efficient communication between units. But most importantly, American tank crews were displaying the confidence and professional competence that came from extensive training, adequate supplies, and the knowledge that they possessed both numerical and logistical superiority over their German opponents. "Major Patterson," I said finally, "I accept your terms. But I have one question. How many tanks does your division possess?" Patterson smiled grimly. "Herr Hauptmann, we have more tanks in this single operation than your entire army has in this sector. And when we lose tanks, they're replaced within days by new vehicles from American factories. Can you say the same about German Panzer production?" His question cut to the heart of Germany's strategic situation. We couldn't replace our losses, couldn't match American production, couldn't sustain the kind of attritional warfare that American industrial capacity made inevitable. As my crew and I surrendered our Panzer IV and prepared for transport to American prisoner facilities, I took one final look at the Sherman tanks that had defeated us. They weren't the inferior tin cans I'd been taught to despise. They were effective weapons systems operated by competent crews and supported by an industrial machine that could produce them in overwhelming quantities. "Herr Hauptmann," Major Patterson said, as American soldiers took custody of our weapons and equipment, "your Panzer crew fought professionally and with honor. But this war is being decided in Detroit and Pittsburgh, not on battlefields in Belgium. You've been defeated by American factories as much as by American soldiers." He was right. The hundreds of Sherman tanks I'd observed near St. Vith represented just a tiny fraction of American armored production, while our 3 German Panzers represented an irreplaceable portion of Germany's dwindling tank reserves. During the transport to American prisoner facilities, I had time to reflect on everything I'd learned during that devastating encounter with American industrial warfare. Individual German tanks might be superior to individual American tanks, but individual superiority became meaningless when confronted with overwhelming numerical disadvantages supported by unlimited replacement capacity. The Americans had solved the problem of tank warfare through mass production rather than technical perfection. Instead of building fewer, better tanks, they had built thousands of adequate tanks and had trained thousands of competent crews to operate them. The result was an armored force that could absorb tremendous losses while continuing to attack, something German panzer forces could never match. But beyond the numbers, American tank crews had demonstrated tactical sophistication that challenged every assumption German officers held about American military competence. The encirclement at St. Vith had been executed with textbook precision by tankers who understood armored warfare as thoroughly as any German panzer officer. "These Americans learn quickly," observed Obergefreiter Möller during our journey to the prisoner camp. "Their early tanks were inferior, but their new tanks are nearly equal to ours, and their crews have become much more skilled." He was correct. American tank development had progressed rapidly from the early Sherman variants that were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons to newer models with improved armor, better guns, and enhanced mechanical reliability. American industrial capacity allowed for continuous improvement and rapid deployment of upgrades, while German tank development was constrained by resource shortages and production limitations. More importantly, American training programs had produced tank crews with skill levels that approached German standards while maintaining the numerical advantages that German training systems could never match. American tankers might have started the war with less experience, but they were learning faster and being replaced more quickly than German crews. My time as a prisoner of war provided additional insights into American industrial capacity and military organization that explained the overwhelming tank formations I'd encountered at St. Vith. American prison camps were supplied with equipment, food, and materials that demonstrated the abundance underlying American military power. "The Americans have so many tanks," observed Hauptmann Friedrich Brenner, a fellow panzer officer who'd been captured during similar circumstances, "because they have the industrial capacity to build them without sacrificing other military production. They don't have to choose between tanks and aircraft and ships. They can build everything simultaneously." This was the fundamental difference between German and American approaches to military production. Germany had to allocate scarce resources between competing military priorities, while America's industrial base was large enough to supply all military needs simultaneously, while maintaining civilian production levels that exceeded German wartime standards. But perhaps most significantly, my captivity allowed me to observe American military culture and understand why their tank crews had become so effective so quickly. American soldiers were encouraged to show initiative, to adapt tactics based on battlefield experience, and to suggest improvements based on practical knowledge rather than doctrinal rigidity. German Panzer training is excellent, Major Patterson told me during one of our conversations at the prisoner camp, but it's based on fixed doctrines that don't adapt quickly to changing conditions. American tank crews are trained to think for themselves, to modify tactics based on what works, to learn from mistakes rather than repeat them. This flexibility had allowed American armored forces to evolve rapidly from the inexperienced units we'd easily defeated in 1943 to the competent formations that had overwhelmed us at Saint-Vith. German training produced excellent individual tank crews, but American training produced tank crews that could function effectively as part of larger formations while adapting continuously to new tactical requirements. The letters I received from my family during imprisonment provided additional perspective on Germany's deteriorating military situation and confirmed that the industrial disparity I'd witnessed at Saint-Vith was reflected across all theaters of operation. My brother Hans, serving with a Panzer regiment on the Eastern Front, wrote that German tank losses were irreplaceable while Soviet tank production seemed unlimited. "We destroy 10 T-34s and 20 more appear the next day," he reported. "Meanwhile, we've been waiting 3 months for replacement parts for our damaged Panzers." Similar reports came from other German officers imprisoned with me. The Wehrmacht was being overwhelmed not by superior individual weapons or tactics, but by industrial production that could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. The war had become a contest between German quality and Allied quantity, and quantity was winning decisively. My understanding of American industrial supremacy was completed when I was transferred to a prisoner camp in Pennsylvania and saw American tank production firsthand. The camp was located near a factory complex that was producing Sherman tanks, and from our barracks we could observe the continuous stream of completed vehicles leaving the facility for shipment overseas. "Mein Gott," whispered Oberleutnant Kurt Weber as we watched dozens of new Sherman tanks being loaded onto rail cars. "They're producing more tanks in one day than our entire regiment possessed at full strength." The sight of American mass production operating at full capacity finally made me understand the mathematical impossibility of German victory. Even if German panzers were individually superior to American tanks, even if German crews were better trained than American crews, even if German tactics were more sophisticated than American tactics, none of these advantages could overcome the simple fact that America could build tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. But my captivity also provided insights into American society and values that explained not just their industrial capacity, but their military effectiveness. American soldiers weren't fighting for territorial conquest or racial superiority. They were fighting to preserve a way of life that had produced unprecedented prosperity and individual freedom. "We don't want to rule the world," Major Patterson explained during one of our discussions. "We just want to make sure that democratic societies can continue to exist, that people can choose their own governments, that individual rights are protected from authoritarian control." This motivation created a different kind of military effectiveness than German ideological indoctrination. American soldiers were fighting to preserve something they valued rather than to acquire something they coveted, and this defensive motivation seemed to produce greater sustained effort than aggressive ideology. The war ended while I was still in American captivity, and the news of Germany's surrender was met with relief rather than celebration by most American guards and officers. They understood that victory meant an opportunity to rebuild rather than an excuse for revenge, and their treatment of German prisoners reflected this constructive attitude. "The war is over, Herr Hauptmann," Major Patterson told me on May 8, 1945, "but the real work is just beginning. Germany will need to be rebuilt along democratic lines, and officers like you will be important in that process if you can accept that German militarism led to disaster." His words proved prophetic. My experience as a prisoner had taught me that German assumptions about military superiority had been catastrophically wrong, that democratic societies could be more militarily effective than authoritarian ones, and that industrial capacity was more decisive in modern warfare than individual technical excellence. When I was repatriated to Germany in 1947, I found a country devastated by war and occupation, but also presented with opportunities for democratic reconstruction under American leadership. Many former German officers were initially reluctant to cooperate with American authorities, but those of us who'd experienced American military competence firsthand understood that cooperation offered the best path forward. We were defeated by superior organization, superior production, and superior values, I told a gathering of former Wehrmacht officers in Hamburg in 1948. The Americans didn't win because they were lucky or because we were betrayed. They won because their system produced better results than ours. This recognition influenced my post-war career as I worked to help establish democratic military institutions in West Germany. The Bundeswehr was organized along American rather than Prussian lines, with emphasis on individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and integration with Allied forces, rather than German military traditionalism. German military excellence was real, I explained to young officers during their training, but it wasn't sufficient to overcome American industrial supremacy combined with democratic motivation. Future German military forces must be part of a larger alliance system rather than instruments of national aggression. The lessons I'd learned from being surrounded by 200 Sherman tanks at Saint-Vith became principles for German military reconstruction. Quality without quantity is insufficient. Individual excellence without systematic support is inadequate, and military effectiveness depends on industrial capacity and popular support rather than just professional competence. In 1954, 10 years after my capture, I was invited to participate in a NATO training exercise that brought together German, American, and other Allied tank crews. The experience of working alongside former enemies as allies provided final confirmation of how completely the nature of warfare and international relations had changed since 1944. "Herr Weber," said Colonel Patterson, the same Major Patterson who'd accepted my surrender at St. Vith, now commanding an American armored brigade, "it's remarkable to see German and American tank crews working together instead of fighting each other." "Colonel Patterson," I replied, "the Sherman tanks that defeated me in 1944 taught me that American military excellence was real, not just industrial luck. Now German tank crews can benefit from American tactical knowledge while contributing our own experience to Allied effectiveness." The NATO exercises demonstrated that American military innovations had continued after the war, with new tanks, improved tactics, and enhanced training methods that built on the lessons learned during World War II. But they also showed that German military expertise, when applied within democratic frameworks and Allied cooperation, could contribute to collective security rather than aggressive conquest. My correspondence with Major Patterson continued until his retirement in 1965, providing ongoing insights into American military development and the evolution of NATO alliance structures. His letters emphasized how the war had taught American officers to respect German military competence, while recognizing that German political systems had channeled that competence toward destructive rather than constructive purposes. "You were excellent soldiers fighting for a terrible cause," he wrote in 1960. "Now you're excellent soldiers fighting for democracy and freedom, which makes you allies instead of enemies." This transformation reflected broader changes in international relations that had grown out of the wartime recognition that military effectiveness alone was insufficient for national success. Countries needed industrial capacity, popular support, and alliance relationships to achieve security in the modern world. The final validation of lessons learned at St. Vith came in 1974, 30 years after my surrender, when I retired from the Bundeswehr with the rank of Oberst and was invited to speak at the American Army War College about German perspectives on armored warfare during World War II. "Gentlemen," I told the assembled American officers, "I once mocked Sherman tanks as inferior tin cans that could never match German Panzer excellence. I was wrong not about individual tank quality, but about the importance of individual quality in modern warfare." I continued, "The 200 Sherman tanks that surrounded my single Panzer IV at Saint-Vith taught me that quantity supported by adequate quality, superior production, and excellent logistics will always defeat quality alone. This lesson applies not just to tank warfare, but to all aspects of military competition between industrial societies." The American officers understood immediately, because they'd learned similar lessons about the relationship between individual excellence and systematic effectiveness. Modern military success required both technical competence and industrial support, both tactical skill and strategic resources, both professional armies and popular commitment. Your Sherman tanks defeated our Panzers, I concluded, not because they were individually superior, but because they represented a military system that was systematically superior. That's the lesson German officers learned too late to affect the outcome of the war, but not too late to influence the construction of effective democratic military institutions. This was my story, Hauptmann Klaus Iron Cross Weber, who learned that military excellence without industrial support is insufficient, that individual superiority without systematic advantages is inadequate, and that mockery of enemy capabilities usually reflects ignorance rather than knowledge. My encounter with 200 American Sherman tanks at Saint Vith taught me that modern warfare is decided by production capacity and organizational effectiveness rather than just individual technical superiority, that democratic societies can be more militarily capable than authoritarian ones, and that former enemies can become valuable allies when they recognize the limitations of their previous assumptions. What struck you most about my story of being surrounded by those Sherman tanks? Have you heard similar accounts from veterans who discovered that their assumptions about enemy capabilities were wrong? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual experiences during warfare can challenge national stereotypes and military doctrines. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Sergeant Major Giuseppe Nonna Romano, an Italian tank commander who learned that American industrial might extend it far beyond military production into every aspect of society. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.